Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. That's right, we've actually got something on Path of Exile 2 after a long focus on Path of Exile 1 on the channel. And that's because Grinding Gear Games has just put out a major interview where Jonathon went over to China to talk with the Chinese player base, a number of their representatives, and also to make a number of announcements, a number of discussions about the launch of the Chinese version of the game. Now, I'll put a link to my summary of the interview, which is over on the Path of Exile 2 subreddit down in the description below. And that will also contain a link to the original interview as well. There's a few particular things that I think are worth your while knowing about here. Firstly, this interview was obviously intended for the Chinese player base first and foremost, so there is quite a Chinese focus to the interview. So there's a fair number of things there that won't apply to those of us that play on the Western version of the game, but there are also a number of things that will apply to us. The Chinese server is going to be coming this year. The business model will start out the same as the early access model that we've got for the international server, and the pricing of that for Chinese players is subject to commercial negotiations taking place at the moment. Now, they're planning to add full Chinese language voiceovers, and also there'll be a couple of differences from the international version. Some of those will be cultural reasons, but probably most of them will be due to just the different regulatory environment in China. There's also the potential for some Chinese-specific MTX in the future, although one of the things that was suggested I think would sell pretty well over on the international servers as well, and that would be a panda shapeshift model for the Druid, which is something that Grinding Gear Games did not commit to, but that was raised by some of the players that were there. The structure of the interview was that there were very different segments of the Chinese player base represented, so there were 5 different people that were brought on as panelists. These were players and content creators. One of them was an esports type, one was a power gamer that's not an esports player, and then 3 people that were more representative of the rest of what you might term the endgame player base. There were a number of questions that were taken both by Jonathon and also by Boo Boo. I apologize if I'm butchering that name, but he's the project leader of the Chinese server. And there's a number of jokes thrown in. Everyone speaks in their own preferred language, and everything is subtitled in English. And so if, like me, you can't understand a word of Chinese, it is still able to be followed. Some of the things that came up in terms of points of discussion. Firstly, there was a lot of discussion of difficulty, and one of the things that Grinding Gear Games consider at the moment is that many skills feel underpowered, and if you pick the wrong one, then the campaign can feel too hard. GGG have a plan in place to address this, and this is coming in 030. There's also plans to increase the amount of XP that players gain from levels 95 to 99, and the details of that are to be confirmed. For the campaign, the single most important announcement I think in the entire video, other than the trade ones, is removal of cruel might be sooner than you think. However, no date is provided there. And then a tutorial is going to be added early into the campaign, because one of the things GGG have noticed is that players that are brand new to the genre, they're not necessarily transmuting their first weapon that they get, they're not necessarily doing other things to craft it, like throwing an augmentation on it, and the players that aren't are really struggling early on, so they want to make sure that that is clearer to do. So that's going to be coming as a tutorial very early in the game. And likely for veteran players, all that means is one guaranteed transmute drop that will be somewhere early in the game. A number of things were raised related to mapping and the mapping experience in general. Now, this is something that was talked about at quite a few different parts of the interview, so I've not tried to keep this in exactly the order that topics were raised in the interview itself. Some of the things that are mentioned in this section were quite late in the interview, but Grinding Gear Games, particularly Jonathon, they still want more unpredictable events in Endgame. A lot of players give the feedback maps feel too large, and Grinding Gear Games are interpreting that in general as maps feel too sparse instead. And their goal is that whether a map is large, whether a map is small, they think it'll feel better when there's more chance for wild stuff to happen. Now, I do think there are 2 problems that Jonathon didn't address here, or that Jonathon's solution of just having more wild things happening isn't going to solve. The first of these is when you've got a map that is just kind of in the way on the overworld, and you just want to get past it because you want to get to something juicy that's behind it. In that situation, you kind of don't have any way to really expedite running that map quicker, and that I think is a common complaint players have, that these solutions Grinding Gear Games are raising don't really address. The other thing that comes up here is that sometimes you want to laser focus on a particular type of mechanic. So you want to run as many breaches as you can. Well, that means that the rest of the map, after you've done the breaches that are present in it, if there are any, the rest of the map feels like a bit of a chore, and if the map is guaranteed not to have any breaches, then you're probably just going to throw a tier 1 scoured map in there just to get it out of the way, and then move on to the next map. So there are a couple of problems, I think, although I do also think that just making maps denser and making maps have more chaotic events in them, it's going to make things feel better, but it's also not a silver bullet solution that addresses everything. Now, during early access, most new mechanics that are added to PoE 2, they'll be reworks of PoE 1 leagues. However, post 1.0, the intention is that new leagues are mostly or always new. One example of one of these reworks that was called out explicitly, I've said for a while that Asmiri Wisps are basically Torment done well, and that's exactly what they are, and Jonathon explicitly mentioned that that was the intention here. This is Torment, but minus the things that make Torment bad, and plus a few things that just make it more reliable. Now, one of the tensions that comes up that a lot of players will raise about mapping, this came up explicitly from the panel, is that there is a tension between wanting to explore the Atlas and hunker down near good towers. And Grinding Gear Games are trying to solve this, but they don't have anything to currently announce on this. They do have some significant changes in the works, but they've got something currently that, whilst not perfect, and not even particularly good, the tower system is at least functional, it's at least reasonable, and so they don't want to scrap that and replace it with something worse. So they've got to be convinced that whatever they replace it with is got to be better, and that's what they're working on. Now, this may or may not involve replacing the concept of towers, that wasn't clarified, but it'll be some significant overhauls that they are working on at the moment, but it's not guaranteed that it's going to be in 0.30, and it's not guaranteed that it's going to solve particular dislikes people have. Classes came up next, and there were a couple of things discussed about Minion builds. One player mentioned the topic of Minion AI, and Jonathon responded to this by saying he's aware of two major problems that they're trying to solve at the moment. The first one is Minion pathing collision issues. Your skeletons keep walking into each other rather than walking closer to the monsters. The second one is Minions dying to boss slams. They acknowledge both of these are issues and that they want to solve them. No promises were made as to a timeline. And next was a question of melee in Path of Exile 2. We've got the fastest weapons, the spears, we've got the slowest weapons, the mauls, we've got one thing that's sort of in between a little bit, and that's the monk and the quarterstaff, but what they're hoping is that when they add medium speed melee weapons, which will be the sword and the axe, that this will really improve the feel of melee for people who hate mace gameplay, which does seem to be a very large percentage of Path of Exile 2's player base. I'm sure that there will be a small number of people that love the way maces feel at endgame, but I'm not one of them, and I don't think there's very many of these people. So Grinding Gear Games are aware that there's a couple of issues here, but they think that the main solution is just going to be to get the axe and the sword into the game, and swords are coming before full release or at full release. So 1.0 will definitely have the sword in it. Now 0.3.0, there is a major goal that they've got, and this relates to classes, which is significantly improving build diversity by upgrading both unpopular ascendancies and skills. However, this prioritization may come at the cost of other major features being added, and it's entirely possible that there will not be a new class in 0.3.0 as a result. The potential for 0.3.0 to not contain a new class was something that has been pulled out of previous interviews. It wasn't explicitly stated in this one, but it's something I felt was worth raising here because it does relate to this topic. They're prioritizing getting those underperforming ascendancies and underperforming skills up to a decent baseline, and that will come at the expense of not prioritizing other things. Grinding Gear Games are looking at each class, what skills are worst or least played on it, and then they're asking themselves, right, how high can we push this right now? How functional can we make this right now? Is it just that players haven't discovered any of the ways to make this skill good, or is the skill genuinely terrible? And then that is a metric for whether or not the skill needs to change, and if it needs to change, by how much. Another major design philosophy change that I think a lot of people will like. They want each component of the combo to be non-awful on its own in 0.3.0. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be fantastic, doesn't mean you're going to be beating Arbiter 4 with it, but it does mean that it's good enough that for every skill there is a story why someone would choose to use it. There was also a bit of discussion of mechanically slow skills here, but it sort of felt like it was contradicting what was talked about earlier when they were talking about two-handed weapons, so I'm not really sure what exactly is going on there. Hopefully 0.3.0 announcements will provide some more info on that. After that, there were a number of questions related to itemization and crafting, but probably the most important thing here, and I'm going to give a really extensive quote from a little bit before 28 minutes into the interview. Grinding Gear Games discuss the trade philosophy, which is a little bit different to their past manifesto, and talking about inflation as a thing they want to combat via friction, rather than item convergence, which was a thing that tended to be talked about more in the past. Now, friction can be either the friction that's imposed by gold when you're trading through Faustus in Path of Exile 1 or Alva in Path of Exile 2, or it can be the time friction that is imposed by doing trades that are through the website and the old system. Anyways, around 27 3/4 minutes in, there is this extensive quote, and I've copied down what Jonathon said word for word. I want to read this one out because it's fairly important. I've cut out things that don't have any particular meaning, like ums and ahs, but these I believe to be Jonathon's exact words. I believe there should be a way to do something similar with things that are not currency items, and this is a feature I think is very important to get before we release the game fully, i.e. before 1.0. So I want to get that feature done as soon as we possibly can, and definitely to try it out. It'll be very interesting to see if we have any inflation issues if we do that, but I think that it will be okay because I think gold has been quite a good experiment. It's interesting because POE has the exact opposite formula from most games. In most games, items are bound to your player and gold is freely tradable, but in POE, the gold is bound to your character and the items are freely tradable. So I actually think we can utilize this to make a trade system which doesn't require all the inconveniences we have now, while still preventing inflation from occurring too much. So I wanted to put a little bit of my own commentary on this. Now, Jonathon talks about inflation here, but I want to be a little bit more precise about what I think he means here. And to do that, what I want to do is take a look at some pricing from Path of Exile 1. Now, fun fact, these prices are actually a little bit wrong, but we're going to be looking at the prices of essences in Path of Exile 1. You don't need to play Path of Exile 1 to follow this. What you'll notice here is that a very small number of items shoot up in price, and then everything else becomes really cheap. Now, it's worth noting that some of these prices are wrong. Deafening Essence of Scorn is actually 17 Chaos, so that is actually more in the first group. But broadly speaking, what happens is that a smaller percentage of items reach a spot where their supply genuinely is less than the demand. And that's the Essence of Horror, Hysteria, Delirium, and Insanity over in Path of Exile 1, and also the Deafening Essence of Scorn to a lesser extent. These ones tend to shoot up, and all the other ones end up falling down really, really low in value. And for those of you that are not Path of Exile 1 players, when something is 2 Chaos in Path of Exile 1, that is very, very cheap indeed. More comparable to something like 4 Exalts in Path of Exile 2. So what tends to happen when there's a low friction trade environment, the items that are in medium demand, they collapse in price. The items that are in high demand, they tend to stay the same or go up, and the items that are in low demand, well, they collapse whether there's trade friction or not. And the reason for this is that the lower the amount of trade friction that there is, the fewer of these items are sitting idle in people's stashes, and as a result, it's kind of like the drop rate has gone up on everything, and when the drop rate goes up on everything, then all the medium rarity stuff collapses in value. That's the sort of thing that all of the friction in the game is designed to avoid, a situation where most of the items that drop are completely worthless because there's already 50,000 of them on the auction house somewhere. This is why I think this is something that's so important for them to get right, and why I think it's most important news in the entirety of the interview, if you're someone that plays either Path of Exile 1 or 2. Anyways, when Grinding Gear Games do have something concrete to announce on this, I think it will be a very, very major part of their advertising of that particular league, and it might be something that they test in Path of Exile 1 first, with a view to seeing, okay, is this something that we actually want in Path of Exile 2 or not? And if it turns out that it's catastrophic in Path of Exile 1, which I kind of don't think it will be if they price the gold costs high enough, but we'll have to see, then it's something that they can then just not roll out in the new game. So a lot to think about there. That's probably the most important news in the entire interview, unless you're someone that's going to be playing on the new Chinese server. Other than that, there was a question that was asked about stash tabs. Grinding Gear Games are going to continue adding special stashes to the store as needed, and these are actually a lot of programming work for them to implement. So in reality, this means they won't be done unless Grinding Gear Games think they'll sell well, but it's more pitched as won't be done unless they think it'll be well received. More crafting methods are going to come with new expansions. Some existing crafting systems aren't being used all that much, and essences are likely to change soon. Essences are one of those spots that were actually reasonably strong, actually very strong in 0.1.0, but then they got massively power crept. So 0.2.0 comes along, introduces the fracturing orb, and this is one of those things where crafting becomes interconnected. The addition of the fracturing orb changes around the relative power of the existing methods of crafting items, and the Chaos Orb becomes one of the most powerful ways to craft. You fracture an item first. Once you're happy with the fracture, then you do the rest of the crafting primarily with Chaos Orbs. They went from a niche tool that was outclassed to essences into something that now completely and comprehensively outclasses essences. After this, there are a couple of questions that were asked by the panel about MTX, and Grinding Gear Games consider it not at all ideal. The many Path of Exile 1 supporter pack MTX don't yet work in PoE 2. This is something that's quite a priority for them to fix, but it is something they're willing to bump if something else is more urgent. So it's something they're working on, but if they need to take an experienced staff member off this porting of MTX from PoE 1 and put them on to trying to work out a particular graphics crash that's happening or something along those lines, then they're absolutely going to do that as well. Consider this a medium priority, something they will do, but that it may take a little while to happen. Then there were a bunch of rapid fire other questions. The first one was a really interesting one. PoE 2 020 removed a bunch of the dual sockets, and the reason Grinding Gear Games did this was they felt there was too much what I would term passive tree convergence. That's my words. The idea there is that passive trees start feeling too similar to each other because people are optimizing to get as many jewels as they can. Now, Grinding Gear Games were like, okay, we've basically got to nerf the jewels. That's the way we address this. And they're not really happy with the current status quo either. And they're looking to up the appeal of some of the non-jewel notables that are on the tree. So currently, one of the problems that you've got is that there's just not enough good choices on the passive tree. They want to sort of change that. One of the ways players had addressed that in the past in 010 was by speccing lots of jewels, but now it's going to be something different there. They do want trees to diverge from each other, neither converging on all the jewels on all the builds like 010, nor on a few good setups that exist in 020. Another question came up that was an interesting one. This is no change to past answers. Are there any plans for massive multiplayer content akin to a World of Warcraft raid? And the answer is no. Grinding Gear Games want solo and multiplayer to be down to personal choice for all content. Now, they do sometimes miss with this. This is my commentary. This is not Jonathon's. In Path of Exile 1, there is no way you want to bring a friend when you're doing Atsuri. Atsuri is miles harder to defeat with 2 players or 3 players than with 1. And at the same time, there are certain types of content that are miles more accessible in group play. For example, All Flames of the Gilded. These are far better to use in a group play. This is something that they don't currently meet their goals at the moment. There's definitely some types of content that are better in single player, some types of content that are better in multiplayer, but that is their goal. And as a result, they're not going to introduce something like WoW Raids, where it's an absolute requirement to have a large number of players. An interesting question that I thought was a bit of fun. How good at the game are Grinding Gear Games' top management? Jonathon considers himself to be a solid player, but not elite. That's my words. And Mark, he considers to be a truly elite player. Is there any chance of a death replay or damage log or something of the sort? Grinding Gear Games wants something along these lines, but it's a while off because it's tough to implement. One thing then that came up from Boo Boo was it is talking about how the Chinese server team are investigating something that's a quite unique solution here. And this does not sound like it's far along, and personally, I don't think this is going to work, but it was an interesting idea anyway. It's talking about using AI, and honestly, I do not like the term AI because it's used as a marketing buzzword to relate to a lot of different, largely unrelated to each other technologies. But for now, I'll use the term AI. Here we're really talking about machine learning, but using machine learning to assess what a player's next steps could be and to provide tips along those sorts of lines. Personally, I don't see this working very well, but who knows? Be interesting to see if they can make it work. Even if it does though, no guarantee it'll port over to the worldwide server. Are there any plans for an in-game loot filter editor? Now this is probably a bit more important for people who play on the Chinese server for a couple of reasons. Firstly, internet access is not necessarily as unrestricted as it is in the rest of the world. And secondly, probably more importantly for a lot of people, is that most of the loot filter design websites that we use on the international servers, those are designed for people who speak English. So this is probably more important for Chinese players than it is for those of us on the international servers. Anyways, Grinding Gear Games consider this to be a good idea. It's on the list, but it's far down the list, was the vibe that I got from what they mentioned there. So don't expect this anytime soon, but it's something they do want to do. Any plans for performance improvements when a lot of player skills are active at once? What GGG are working on here is a system where specific skills get their core parts prioritized. Unimportant parts of the skill can then be dynamically culled, which can then improve performance. If they can nail this It'll be fantastic, but it's also really, really difficult to do. And then we had perhaps one of the most interesting things that came up in the whole of the discussion. Sometimes players ask for one feature, but the game developers have a different way of addressing the underlying concern in mind. This is something that was really cool. The question was asked, are there any plans for a training dummy so that we can see the amount of damage we're doing in our hideouts and the like? Now, the plan that Grinding Gear Games are going for here, and they seem to have a fair bit of work done on this, a significant upgrade that is planned to pausing. So when you pause, you can mouse over a monster and you can see damage simulation numbers against that monster, as well as seeing the same boss damage info that you get in-game at the moment. Now, the dummy wouldn't work with conditional damage, whereas this is going to work with all sorts of conditional damage that you can scale up on a monster. For example, Path of Exile 1 example here, if you have Convergence on the Elementalist and you attack a hideout training dummy, and that training dummy is a unique monster, then Convergence is going to proc. But if that training dummy was a rare monster, was coded as a rare monster, then you'd get increased damage because you're wearing Headhunter. You could be in a situation in a map where one or both of these effects are in play, or perhaps neither of them are in play because your Convergence has fallen off. Well, with this system, you can pause the game and you can check what your damage is right now if you want. So it'll work with all conditional damage. I really hope they can do this well. It's a cool idea, but it's also one that sounds like it'll be tough to implement. And finally, there was one last thing that was raised, talking about defenses on players, so the balance between armor, evasion, and energy shield. Interestingly, on the Western servers, it's pretty universally considered that armor is the worst of these, that evasion is reasonable, and that energy shield is the strongest. Interestingly, on the Chinese server, it appears that there is a higher opinion of armor and a lower opinion of evasion. And this was put down to potentially the fact that there's no visual feedback or sound feedback when your evasion protects you from taking damage. So if you're trying to actively dodge a monster's ability, you dodge roll out of the way, and then it does actually clip you, but it bounces off your evasion rating, that is exactly the same as if you didn't get clipped by that skill in terms of the feedback to the player. So what they're looking at is options for addressing this, but this is going to be something that will be very difficult because for Grinding Gear Games to do this, they would then need to code this into every monster skill in the game. So it's definitely not something that can be done easily. So before we finish with the obligatory comment about Val Orbs and interesting results, there is one more question that needs to be discussed, and that is, when is 030 likely to come out? Well, the last word we had from Grinding Gear Games is that they're going to a 4-monthly release cycle. So that means that April, August, December are the release dates for the Path of Exile 2 expansions, and February, June, and October for Path of Exile 1. So with all of that in mind, there are 5 potential weekends during August, or 5 potential Fridays. They pretty much always release on a Friday US time zones, so I'm going to assume that continues. It could be Friday the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, or the 29th. Let's start with the 3 that I don't think work, and that is the 15th, the 22nd, the 29th. Why don't they work? They clash with Last Epoch. Now, the reason that this is a problem is that, firstly, it'd look really bad because the last time there was a Last Epoch release, it actually had to delay because Grinding Gear Games had planned, I think, to release their 020 update during the middle of March, but then they ended up having delays, and that pushed them back into a collision with Last Epoch's release. Grinding Gear Games were like, okay, we're just going to announce that we're going to bring it out on the first weekend of April, and Last Epoch thought, oh no, that's going to destroy our launch, we're going to defer ours. There was a lot of backlash from Path of Exile community, Last Epoch community, but also it's worth noting there was probably quite a bit of backlash from Tencent to this delay as well, because Tencent own all of Grinding Gear Games and a fair chunk of 11th Hour gamers as well. So with that in mind, I don't think we're going to see a repeat of that. Now that means the 1st of August and the 8th of August, they're the dates that would allow every promise the Grinding Gear Games have made so far to be kept. But I don't think we should dismiss the possibility of slippage out to the 5th of September. If Grinding Gear Games are confident that they could release on the 22nd of August, and you were to take a poll, would you prefer we release on the 22nd of August or the 5th of September? I think you would find that a large percentage of the player base would opt for the 5th of September. That would then mean that they can check out Last Epoch first as well, and then decide on which one they want to spend more time playing. So those are the 3 dates I think are most likely at the moment. 8th of August probably feels the most likely to me. The 1st of August definitely still plausible, although if it is the 1st of August, we'll get definite confirmation of that this week. That's because Grinding Gear Games announce firm release dates almost always 23 days before the patch goes live. The 1st of August, the 8th of August, both viable. So is the 5th of September. That would technically break a promise that's been made, but I think it would be more accepted than launching on the 15th, the 22nd, or the 29th, where there's going to be a major clash with a game that has a lot of overlap both in players and in shareholders with Path of Exile. Anyways, that's all I got for the moment. May your Varlobs have interesting results.